Hello, everybody. I am delighted to be with Professor David Gramling, who is an authority on multilingualism. He has published two provocative books recently. One of them is called The Invention of Monolingualism, which came out a little earlier. And his most recent book is The Invention of Multilingualism, which came out, I hope you can see it. Yeah, which came out, I think, last year, both from Cambridge University Press. And um, both are provocative, as I said, thought provoking, and they exhibit his enormous erudition, as well as they're a very new kind of books in the sense that he talks about things and talks about the topics, and his approach to multilingualism is very different and original compared to a lot of books that we read. And in fact, a lot of books have been published in recent years. So, given that we have a limited amount of time, I'm going to go directly into a discussion of the book with a bunch of questions. And so, welcome, David.
Thank
So,
you
I'm
much.
looking forward to a very interesting conversation. So, let me start with a very simple question. The term multilingualism is widely used, as you know, yet, your book is titled The Invention of Multilingualism. In what sense are your ideas an invention?
Well, I'm convinced, I believe that multilingualism is as old as humanity, and that it is much older than monolingualism, which is a very recent colonial invention. So only maybe 400 or 500 years old. And so I probably should have titled the book The Reinvention of Multilingualism, because uh, human beings have been inventing ways of speaking using multiple different codes and repertoires forever. And the constraint into using only one to the exclusion of others is really something that colonial modernity invented. And so what I think has been happening in the last couple of decades is a reinvention of multilingualism to serve purposes that I do not support, which are revenue generating purposes and commercial purposes that really get us away from the everyday practice of multilingualism and move multilingualism away from people and into profit. And so I think that's the reinvention that really concerns me and that really drove
Yeah.
me to write the book.
In fact, what you say seems to be true in many ways. I come from India, and in India, of course, we experienced colonialism, uh, European colonialism in many ways, and for many centuries. And one of the questions that they constantly asked in the census and elsewhere is, "What is your mother tongue?" And it was very difficult for a lot of Indians to answer that question because we normally don't have one mother tongue,
Right.
and we have our what is your native language. It was very difficult because we normally grow up speaking several languages, and so in one sense, the whole notion of the mother tongue and a native speaker, native language, all of these things are, as you said, colonial reinvention, colonial introductions. Let me move on to the next question that I have, and you already alluded to that a little. You say that multilingualism is an amorphous. It's an amorphous, capacious, and not a very unified conception. And you compare it to, for example, many other concepts that we use in contemporary discourse, such as feminism. So, is the concept of multilingualism something that needs to be dismantled, and why?
Ah, well, It's interesting. I mean, feminism, I started to identify with feminism in the 1990s. And so it's been 25 years that I've identified quite strongly and emotionally and personally with feminist thinking. And so when I noticed in the past 5 or 7 years in applied linguistics, for example, that a lot of people wanted to throw out the concept of multilingualism in favor of things like translanguaging or something like this. I thought, why are we so eager to go post multilingual, or in the same way as I see people trying to go post feminist?
Post-feminist.
I think that there is absolutely plenty within the concept and the history of feminism to stick with and to love and to cherish and to cultivate. And I feel the same way about multilingualism. I think that the promise of multilingualism, at least on a political and cultural level, is yet to be fulfilled. Same thing with feminism. Feminism is, for me, a future-oriented endeavor that we are still working towards. So the notion that we would dismantle it for something better does not appeal to me.
Very true. So, uh, related to that is the question of how this concept of multilingualism has been reinterpreted. You already alluded to that. And to paraphrase your arguments in this fascinating book in a crude fashion, the concept of multilingualism has been hijacked and repurposed for commercial purposes. And would you please explain in some detail how this paradigm shift has come about? The shift from thinking of multilingualism as pride in identity
Mm.
to multilingualism as some a strategy of making profit, or what one might call, or in fact, I think you call it, a carpet bagging of the concept.
Yeah, there's been a lot of applied linguists who have written really persuasively about this. Guadalupe Valdez, Monica Heller, Alexandre Duchesne. I just kind of came a little bit late to the party, and um, what I've noticed is that, starting in World War II, the innovation, or the invention of machine translation, cryptography, this ideal of what Stephen Kellman, the literary comparatist, calls an omnilingual aspiration, access to all languages. This was a dream that was really key to fighting World War II. But it only became really possible or plausible technologically in the early 1990s with cross-linguistic, algorithmic, large batch corpus-driven
Data.
technologies. And so up until the 80s, bilingualism was really a set of ideals that was carried by activists, by educational linguists, Afro-Latinx, Asian American, um, uh, activists and movements, and in the United States at least. And come the 1990s, it was kind of this industry of computational linguistics and machine translation raced ahead and became the darling of all sorts of states and governments and contract kind of getting. And so in some ways that industry started to profoundly overshadow the popular movements that had brought bilingualism to the fore in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, at least in the United States. And so I call it carpetbagging because the industry, and I love and admire these technologists who are able to create these platforms. They're amazing innovations, but politically there's a deeply problematic trend to replace popular bilingualism and the way it's practiced in communities with technological solutions which see multilingualism as a problem to be solved.
Yes, yes. And in fact, Google Translate is one very simple example of this. So the way they think that everything can be solved very simply by just typing your expressions, and so you don't need to learn the other language simply because, in fact, it happened in our own university. When we
Right.
tried to introduce some teaching of some languages, an associate dean asked our chair, why do you need all this? Don't you have this app and that
Mhm.
app and so on and so forth?
Yep.
And we
Yep.
didn't know how to respond to that. And this coming from a philosopher.
Yep. Yep. I mean,
All right. So,
I just, there are a lot of uh, disciplines or a lot of administrative kind of maneuvers that are happy to be language indifferent or are happy
yes,
to say, oh, now we've got technology for this. We don't need actual embodied speakers of these languages. I think
yeah,
that is
yeah,
such a mistake, and it's going to catch
that's
up with
right.
us in a couple of decades.
Yes, yes, you're right. And you talk about all of this as part of your book, which is extremely large in scope. It's a very ambitious book, but the ambition is matched by your erudition. You deal with a lot of disciplines. You analyze politics, machine translation, literary theory, forensic linguistics, multinational commerce, and even the Hayek like decentralized economics, which is now becoming more and more important with these bitcoins and cryptocurrency and so on, and natural language processing technology, and on, as well as in the range of topics that you deal with, issues of colonialism, decolonization, racism, essentialism, and very importantly and very currently, social justice. All of these are, of course, intimately connected with multilingualism. And so, in that sense, your book on multilingualism is perhaps the most ambitious and the most widest ranged of all the books that I have come across. But my question was, is the field of applied linguistics ready for this tour de force?
Well, um, applied linguistics is a global, international set of colleagues, from everywhere around the world. And I believe that if astrophysics and astronomy and these kinds of fields can set their sights really high for what is knowable, what can they do with a baffling a data set that is complicated and daunting. I think we can do it too. And why should applied linguistics have lower expectations for itself as a field than any other field, astrophysics or nuclear chemistry or anything like this? So in some ways, I was really moved by reading Lourdes Ortega's 2013 article about interdisciplinarity in second language acquisition, which was really a call to action to
Yes.
expand our sites, draw from more fields, be in communication with more disciplines, and be a kind of connector for lots of different disciplines rather than kind of fortifying our own methodologies. So in some ways, the book was a bit of a response to her call to action, and I think that we the next couple of decades are going to require us to become deeply involved in things like economics, which and business, which we might personally not want to be involved in, but it's going to be a requirement for analyzing the types of data that come to us.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and important perspective because the trend in linguistics, certainly for the last probably 50 years, has been to narrow the scope of the field and to concentrate on things that we can solve in the sense of focusing on the structure of the language as opposed to the use and things like that, in terms of a Chomskyan paradigm that I'm talking about, as
Right.
opposed to the sociolinguistic or anthropological linguistic and other paradigms
Yeah.
which talk about the interconnectedness of language with a lot of other things,
Yeah.
such as culture. And so it is very important. I have myself advocated this sort of thing. And I'm glad that you underline the importance of that. And of course, economics, for example, that is one thing that has been totally neglected as far as linguistics is concerned. So if you ask the question, Fishman was one of those who asked the question a long time ago, but he came up with a rather strange answer. That's a different thing. About how multilingualism is not really necessarily necessary, ideally, because that would be redundant and so on and so forth. But the question is, what is the value in terms of monetary value of language? And that is something that people do
Yeah.
are concerned about. And so we should be able to give some kind of an answer. And so, okay, let's move on. Related to this, we just talked about Ortega's work on second language acquisition and so on, and the need to relate that to other fields and so on. And also the need to relate our theories to other cultures. So there have been many critiques of the ethnocentrism in fields like second language acquisition and teaching English as a second language and so on, and their inability to grapple with real world phenomena such as code mixing and the hybridity of multilingual language use. And this has been this has led to um, currently fashionable theories such as translanguaging. And people have talked about how there has been a multilingual turn in applied linguistics and second language acquisition studies and so on. And this is based on a rejection of the concept of language as a bordered, countable entity,
Mhm.
and talking about it as more fluid. But in the context of all this, there seems to be a problem, it seems to me, and that is that monolingualism does exist. People do. There are monolinguals who speak only one language. Whatever the uh, historical accretions in within that single language may be, but still, in Bakhtian view. But whatever the hybridity is within that, but still, the people who speak a single language think that they are speaking one language. And there are many contexts in which even multilinguals use just one language as opposed to the other. For example, when they are talking to monolinguals and so on. And so, this rejection of single languages or the concept of single languages, isn't it something like throwing the baby with the bathwater?
I think so. I empirically speaking, of course, languages are not contiguous, consistent essences. They're definitely not. But historically, lots of institutions, governments, empires, etc., have put a lot of energy into producing those monolanguages. And so they are actually durable historical products. Sorry. And so we have to deal with the actual historical products that have been made for us, and not to pretend that they're mere constructions that we can kind of wish away. And the other part of this for me is that when I talk with people who say they speak Hindi, or they say they speak English, or they say they speak Japanese, I'm not going to contradict them with a set of data that says, well, what you're really speaking is, I really need to take people at their word, And in some ways, in what I worry about with the accountability and nameability discourse is that it somehow takes away from lay users of language their prerogative to say what it is that they speak. And so if someone says, I speak Dominican Spanish, I would love to acknowledge that they have claimed that, and that claiming that is their right. And I don't want to, kind of come back to them with a kind of an empirically informed response that says that's actually not true. So I feel like in some ways taking lay users, everyday users of language seriously in what they say they're doing, but also recognizing the historically produced nature of some of these monolanguages, and dealing with the power of that history, rather than what I think sometimes academics will do, which is to say, oh, it's just a construction. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah.
So that gives me a nice segue into another question, and that is your book uh, deals a lot with what one might call, and in fact, you yourself call, the a discourse about multilingualism, how multilingualism has been discussed, and how it has been theorized, and how it has been analyzed, and so on and so forth. Uh, as opposed to, if one might make this distinction, if it's not too artificial, to multilingualism in use, that is real world use of different languages and different domains and different purposes and so on and so forth, etc. So in that sense, uh, the book seems to be more dealing with the preoccupations of European theorizing,
Mm,
especially French like theorizing.
yeah.
Uh, and how relevant would this be for people, let us say, in the developing countries, who are not so much concerned, or so far at least, they have not been so much concerned with theorizing so much about it,
Yeah.
as still dealing with the descriptions of the actual use of languages by multilinguals and
Yeah.
the implications of it, and explaining it in
Yeah.
terms of how it came about historically, for example, in terms of convergence, etc., and also in terms of actual use in domains, and also the implications for structure in terms
Yeah.
of code mixing, and
Yeah.
implications for psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics in terms of location and the interaction of these languages and so on. So, in other words, what is the relationship between this heavy theorizing
Mm,
and actual multilingualism in use?
yeah. I think, okay, so I've got my phone in my hand. Anybody who has a cell phone is carrying a theoretical apparatus for multilingualism. And whether or not they want to be, they're carrying or I would say actually a theoretical apparatus for monolingualism, because as soon as your everyday practices interact with a technology like this, someone else is starting to shape your multilingualism for you. And so I think the point of the book and is to point to this rising discourse of multilingualism that no longer belongs to actual everyday users, and say, this is actually coming for your practices. This set of industries and platforms and innovations wants to tell you what is good multilingualism, how it should work, and to instruct you. Here are a lot of tools and affordances for how to communicate. And so in some ways, what I try to do in the book is, and of course, Monica Heller and Alexandre Luchain have done this before, and others, is to say, multilingualism no longer, unfortunately, no longer belongs to people alone. It belongs to very powerful industrial and economic
Corporations.
interests. And we need to name and mark and identify those interests so that we can protect, everyday users of language from them, and to say those are not necessarily your friends, nor are they the friends of your languages. So be careful, and these are not just European interests either. They're not just coming from Luxembourg or from, Frankfurt. They're also coming from Mumbai and from Tehran. I mean, the places where these technologies are being produced and honed are global. And so I'm not sure whether this is only a Eurocentric endeavor anymore. It certainly was up until, let's say, the 70s. But as soon as customs deregulation kind of came around, the production of monolingual technologies was a global affair.
Yeah, you're right. The questions need to be reframed, not in terms of the developing world as opposed to European technology and things like that. But because technology is worldwide these days and it can be anywhere and it doesn't have a home as such, so it can be supranational.
Mhm.
And so, but your point, I think, is very well. Your many points, they are, I think, very well taken, because they make us, they are cautionary, as you said, that we need to think about multilingualism not simply in terms of the old-fashioned ways of thinking about it, but it's being reconceptualized and reformulated and repurposed, as it were,
Yeah.
for all kinds of interests, and that we better wake up and be aware of these things, and also take it back, as it were.
Right. Right.
So I think this has been fascinating. Unfortunately, we are out of time, I think, and this is a you have raised a lot of questions that I'm sure will be debated in many academic as, and also I hope in many non-academic and cultural and political contexts as well. We wish you well with your book, and thank you for making us think about all of these things.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so much
David.
for this lovely conversation.
Thank you so much.